Okay, so thanks for showing up tonight. I'm a speech therapist. I'm a board certified behavior analyst. And so I just thought there was something that came up in one of the ASHA groups, and it was somebody wanting to know more about the VB MAPP. And so I thought that I would just go ahead and do a free Zoom session to give people a better understanding of exactly what Zoom is or what VB MAPP is. So this is just an intro to the VB MAPP, which stands for Verbal Milestones Assessment and Placement Program, and it was created by Dr. Mark Sundberg. He's a PhD and he's also a BCBA D. So a little bit about me. I'm a speech therapist. I work 1 day a week in a private school for students with autism, and I also work in a public school as a speech therapist for middle school age group students. I kind of call myself more of a behavioral speech language pathologist in the fact that I am a BCBA, but most of my work is acting as a speech language pathologist and kind of looking at language with a behavioral lens, if that makes sense. I'm passionate about the dissemination of information from the field of ABA for SLPs because I don't think there's a lot of good information out there, or if it is, it's just kind of hard to access. So I just am trying to make it easier for everybody. And I'm planning on providing free Zoom sessions about evidence-based practice quarterly throughout the year. If you have ideas about future topics, let me know. I'm on some of the ASHA SIG groups, and I'm also on some of the Facebook professional groups. And so I think it's just kind of given me ideas about what people might want to learn about. But if you have ideas, go ahead, shoot me an email and let me know. Our agenda is that we're going to discuss the verbal operants, what exactly those mean, because that helps us understand how to give the VB MAPP. We're going to talk about what the VB MAPP is, when we use it, what we should know before we administer it. How can this assessment help us with assessment for students who are hard to assess, and also for goal setting for these students, and then where you can purchase it and get support materials. I am in no way affiliated with the VB MAPP other than I just use it. I'm not getting any royalties or anything for talking with you. I just really believe in the power of the tool, so I wanted to share this. What are the verbal operants? So B.F. Skinner, who we probably learned about in Intro to Psychology, wrote a book called Verbal Behavior, and it's a focus on verbal operants, which are just functional units of language. So he had a very different thought about how we acquire language. He really thinks it has to do a lot with reinforcement and speaker-listener combinations and things of that nature. So here's the idea. The idea is that there's one word. I took iPad because a lot of my students like iPads, and that there's all these different verbal operants or these different units. So manding means to request something. So if I'm going to mand for iPad, I would maybe see the iPad, or I'd think about the iPad and I'd say, iPad, I want iPad, however I'm using my language. So that's what mand means, to demand. And then tacting means to label it. So maybe you see the iPad across the room, maybe someone shows you a picture of an iPad and you say iPad. So we call that tacting. An intraverbal is a fill in the blank or answering a question. So it just means there's no point-to-point correspondence between the different speakers' behaviors. So I may say, I like to play the, and the student would say iPad. Or I may say, what do you like to do during free time? And the student may say iPad. Those would all be intraverbals. And an intraverbal is the cornerstone for conversation, for that back and forth reciprocity, which is so very important, as we know as speech language pathologists, if you guys are speech language pathologists, that it's so very important for us to work on that back and forth flow of communication. And so that's where intraverbals come into play. And then an echoic is another verbal operant that he discussed, and that just means imitation. So verbal imitation. So if I say iPad, can the student say it after me? And so there are different verbal operants, just so you know, but these are the main ones, and it's important to have a working knowledge of these different verbal operants before you look at this assessment, because this assessment looks at those different verbal operants, okay? So this just goes over it one more time. A mand is a request, asking for reinforcers that you want. So a tendency to say cookie when you want it. If I see a cookie, I can say cookie. If your learner's saying 2 words, they may say eat cookie. So it really just depends on the student's language level. The gold standard for manding, just as an aside, is for a student to think about something that maybe isn't even present and for them to say what they want. So we talk about manding a lot in the world of verbal behavior because it is a main focus, because as if any of you have your own children, you realize that your learners, your students, your kiddos, they start by requesting. This is where communication all begins. And what's interesting about the MAND really quickly is that a lot of the tests that we learn about in graduate school, you know, maybe the PLS or the self preschool or things that maybe you're giving learners at this different language level, at this lower language level or younger age, don't really look at manning. And that's what's so sad, because that's so very important. And oftentimes as speech language pathologists, we're looking at an assessment, we're evaluating a student, we're getting information, and then that's how we base our goals. But if our assessments don't even have manding on them, then we're really missing such a big chunk of communication that's so important for students. And echoic is verbal imitation. So it's just repeating exactly what's heard. A tendency to say cookie because they heard someone else say it. Or if you're working on, you know, the Kaufman cards or the Sign and Say cards by Tamara Casper, or your own vocal imitation targets. I have a student I've been making my own cards for, so that's vocal imitation. Interverbal, really quickly, again, is just answering WH questions, having a conversation, filling in the blank, okay? Tacting is labeling, so naming, it could be identifying objects, actions, a tendency to say cookie when you see a cookie. Listener behavior is another thing to talk about, and it wasn't one of the main verbal operants, but it is something that is assessed in the VB MAPP, so I wanted to go over it. And sometimes we may call this receptive language skills. Dr. Sundberg refers to this as listener behavior. So it's following instructions or complying with a request, a tendency to follow the direction, get the cookies when someone has given you this direction. So what's really nice about the VB MAPP is that it looks at this type of listener behavior too, which I think a lot of early learners have such trouble with all of these things that I'm talking about. So it really gives us a nice direction on where to go. And I really feel like why I love doing this assessment and talking about it is I started using it maybe 8 years ago. I was working down in Austin, Texas, as an autism facilitator, and I was helping teams of speech therapists, teachers, give this assessment. And so I really had time to learn a lot about it. But why I liked it and why I think it's so great, and I still use it today, is that it really gives you a scope and a sequence of what to work on with students who you're not going to get a good language snapshot on standardized tests that we typically give in our field, in my opinion. So students with autism and challenging behavior need a collaborative and team approach. We all know that, and I'm sure that a lot of you have tuned in because maybe you've heard of VB MAPP, or maybe there's outside consultants and they're using it, or maybe you guys are actually using it in your school, which is great too. And it's just, you know, it's kind of a lengthy assessment, so there's a lot to learn about it. So we obviously need to start with assessment. There's many options, but you know, it's hard for us to learn about this early learners language level with our traditional measures that we've learned so much about, at least for me. I've been out in the field for probably 14 years now. So I love the verbal behavior milestones assessment, and for short, we call it the VB MAPP. So this is what it looks like. There's a protocol that it comes with, and we'll look inside the protocol. I emailed Dr. Sundberg just to make sure that it was okay that I talk about the VB MAPP in these Zoom sessions, and I also have some ASHA approved webinars that are on different CEU provider websites, and I always talk about the VB MAPP because it's just a great measure, and I hope that you guys will learn more about it and will hopefully feel the same way. It is based on Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. It is criterion referenced evaluation, and the purpose is to determine a child's skills and barriers in order to design an individual program that best fits the child. And I think that's what's so important, is that all these students that we work with, I think the incidence of autism now is 1 in 68, and I was reading something from ASHA, and it said 90% of school-based speech pathologists work with kids with autism, and everything's so individualized, and it takes time, and I know we're always strapped for time, but even if you don't give this full assessment, which, you know, that's the recommendation, is to give the full assessment, obviously, it really is just a nice guide for how to systematically work on language and how to work on language in this idea of working on it in these different verbal operants, how to work on tacting, how to work on manding, what's the scope and sequence for interverbal behavior, things of that nature. And it really gives useful information for all members of the team. So if you have teachers, it's going to give you really good pre-academic information. It goes to 0 to 48 months. I'll show you the different levels. There's 3 different types of learners. So you may have a level 1 learner, which is 0 to 18 months, and so on and so forth. It goes level 2, level 3. The email or the web address is avbpress.com, and that's where you can get more information about it. There's a lot of good downloads and things like that that will help you give the assessment as well. So there's different components. There's a skills assessment, which looks at the different verbal operants like we've been talking about. It's sectioned into 3 different levels, like I said. So the first level 1 is 0 to 18 months. Level 2 is 18 to 30 months. And then level 3 is 30 to 48 months. And so there's different skills that you assess. You either directly assess or you observe. And there's a large guidebook that helps you know how to complete the assessment too as well. So if you're somebody who is helping out to give it, maybe your school district has already bought that and you could look through it, but there are protocols that you're supposed to have for each student. And then there's also a guidebook that will tell you more about the assessment and will tell you exactly how to give the assessment, which is lengthy, but it's really, best practice and is good just to kind of read through so you have a full understanding of why Dr. Sundberg created this and what information it really gives us. So in addition to that skills assessment, it also has task analysis, which is really nice because it breaks down the different skill assessments into, there may be prerequisite skills to get to the next level, and it really goes step by step. And I really like to look at that task analysis. It's in the back of the protocol book, and that really helps me write objectives and write IEPs and things like that. And I don't know, I just always need help with thinking of how to write IEPs and objectives. So it's a nice help for that. There's also a barriers assessment, which is great. It looks at different things that could be barriers for students to learning, like does your student engage in self-stimulatory behavior? Does your student have trouble scanning when there's larger arrays of cards and things like that? So that kind of is nice if you're transitioning a student to a least restrictive environment, or you're transitioning a student from a specialized program to a public school program. So it really looks at those barriers. And what's nice is you could give that when the student first comes in, and then after a year of programming, you could give it again and see, hopefully, with specific instruction that the barriers are not as high for instruction. There's also a section for IEP goals, which gives information that could be directly related to IEPs that you create. So this is just organization. There's the manual that you could purchase. Each student should have their own protocol book, because in the front, you can, after you give the entire assessment, then you can fill out a grid, which I'm going to show you what that looks like. And then over time, if you give it when the first student comes to you, or he's on your caseload or up for an evaluation, then you could lapse it like a year later, or if you're doing every 3-year testing, you could do it then, and you could hopefully shade in different parts of the VB MAPP so that you can show that progress has been made. It's a nice way to show that progress has been made for these students who I think sometimes it's really hard to show that we've made progress, because sometimes it's hard to goal set for them because we have to really break things down. It's also, if you're more of an app kind of person, it's available through the Apple Store. There's a VB MAPP app. Okay, I usually use the protocol books just because the people I work with, I think they would probably want to take my iPad and use it if I was using the iPad. But so I'm like old school, and I just have the book out. So areas of interest, it looks at manding, requesting, tacting, listener responding, so following directions and things like that. It looks at matching to sample. So can the student, in a messy array of 10 or a messy array of 4, can the student match picture to picture? If I make a pattern, can the student follow it after me? It also looks at play skills, which I think is really nice, and social skills, because that's really hard to assess for our learners. So a lot of my students, based on giving this VB MAPP, have goals for independent and cooperative leisure. And the VB MAPP really guides me in that, helping me assess, okay, how do I really want to break down this skill? At this age level, what should a student really be doing for independent or cooperative leisure? And what are our goals when we get together in a group? Because I know oftentimes, especially as school-based therapists, we tend to group kids because we need to, and it can be very good for them based on what they need to work on. And so this kind of gives me a scope and a sequence of, oh, okay, this is what the student is having trouble with, and this is how I can work on it. motor and echoic imitation, so it looks at gross motor imitation, fine motor imitation, verbal imitation. There's a whole section on an echoic assessment that was created by Dr. Esch, who is a speech language pathologist and a board certified behavior analyst, I believe, and it goes through different syllable structures, and it gives you an idea of where your student is and if they need to work on echoic imitation, where you would start with that. Looks at intraverbals, so from fill in the blanks, answering what is your name, all the way up to reading a passage and answering questions about it. It also, which I think is these other parts here are great for, they're great for speech therapists, but they're also great for teachers who are on your team. So what does a student's classroom behavior look like? Can the student be in a group for 5 minutes without problem behavior? Can a student go to the bathroom, wash their hands without any assistance or just with a verbal direction? So it looks at those different types of skills that are so very important for our students accessing a general curriculum. And then it also, the level 3, looks at beginning reading, writing, and math. Does a student know different numbers? Can a student write all the different letters? Can a student read a couple of words? So it gives us a vision of, are they academic? And if they're not, where do we start with that? So these are things that were suggestions from avbpress.com website of things that we should know before giving the assessment. So we should have a basic working knowledge of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. So hopefully today we talked really briefly about it, but there are other books out there. There's a book called The Verbal Behavior Approach, if this is something you want to learn more about, and that's by Mary Lynch Barbera. And she is a PhD BCBA who also has a son on the spectrum. And I read it when I first moved to Austin, and I knew that I was going to be working in a verbal behavior type program because it's really easy to read, but it has the science and it has all the different terminology in it, and it really brings this verbal behavior approach to life. So if it's something you want to check out, that's a book that's widely available. So tonight we talked about that with a brief overview. You should have a knowledge of basic behavior analysis, so knowing how to prompt a student, knowing that when you're working through this assessment, you don't want to give inadvertent prompts like I often do with my students. If they don't answer a question right, I can see myself like mouthing it to them, and that's an inadvertent adult prompt, which we do a lot and don't think about. Knowledge of basic linguistic structure, which if we're speech pathologists, like check, we have that. Understand typical linguistic development. Speech therapists have that. Knowledge of autism and other developmental disabilities. So these are, definitely speech therapists, it's within our scope to give this assessment. It's within a scope of a teacher to give this assessment. It's within the scope of a psychologist to give this assessment, of a BCBA to give this assessment. Anybody who kind of has these working knowledge bases should be okay in giving the assessment. Things to note when I've given the assessment, I usually do it if I have a new student on my caseload. I also do it sometimes before an annual IEP. And if there's, I'm in Ohio, we call it ETR testing, every 3-year testing to see if a student qualifies for special education. So that's when I typically give this assessment. And if I'm doing it, sometimes if I'm doing it all by myself as the speech therapist, I may hone in on a couple pieces and parts of the assessment that I think are most important for my learner at that time. But the gold standard is that we'd have this collaborative team of speech therapists, intervention specialist, special education teacher, or whatever you want to call them, wherever you're at regionally, and that we would all be kind of giving this assessment together. So those are the different, you may hear, depending on where you are in your VB MAPP knowledge, you may hear somebody say, oh yeah, that student's a level 1 learner. So that's kind of what they're referring to, like that type of language level. And a level 2 and 3 learner, so in my eyes, a level 1 learner is more of an early learner, a level 2 and a level 3 learner are more intermediate learners. And that's just my subjective opinion there. So just to give you an idea, I just wanted to let you, without looking at the guidebook, the scope and sequence of tacting. So tacting is tested in levels 1, 2, and 3. So it starts out, can the student tact or label 10 items? Okay, can a student do that? Then it looks at, can the student, and these aren't every single thing that assesses, but I just wanted to share like a brief little snippet to give you an idea. Can the student tact 10 actions? That's important. Can the student tact verb noun and or noun verb phrases? Okay, this is how it's getting systematically more complex. And then can the student use grammatically correct sentences? So that's why I like it so much, because I'm thinking to myself like, well, I do have a student that can tact 10 actions, but I don't know if he can tact verb noun and noun verb phrases. Okay, that's where I want to start my intervention. That's what we want to hone in on. Other helpful downloads on that website, there are VB MAPP IEP goals, which you can go to. There's a download section on the left-hand side. It says download, and this stuff is all free. There's noun and verb lists, so if you want to see what verbs your kiddos know or students on your caseload, it gives you an idea what verbs are there. It also has a sample report, which is nice because you're probably thinking like, okay, what is this assessment and how do I even report on it? So it has sample reports, which I think is always really helpful. And there's just a lot of really good information on there if you are really into wanting to learn more about this, or Dr. Sundberg's work, or what the verbal behavior approach even means. There is a lot of good information and presentations that he's given that are pretty insightful. So this is what the master scoring form looks like. So you can see it's like level 1 is at the bottom, then level 2, and then level 3. So what's nice is the different skill areas are there: manding, tacting, listener, play, social, the things that we've been talking about. So what you can do is you can really look at this student right here and you can say, oh, this is really a level 3 learner. This student is really more of an intermediate learner, and where we're going to start our intervention is level 2 for a couple of the different things, and then mostly level 3, that's what we're going to work on. So it gives us an idea. And then you can color code it by year, or every 6 months, or every year, how intensive the program you're in, and then you can shade it differently, and then you can bring it to the meeting and say, oh, look, we've made this progress and how exciting. So this is what it looks like up close. And I think that it's just a really nice visual. I just did a complete VB MAPP for a student at the private school that I work at for 3-year testing, and we gave it together as a team, and I scored it. I mean, it does take kind of a long time to do, but it gives you such great information, and why I like it is that you're just not guessing. You're not guessing about what you should work on with students. You really have an idea, and this assessment really gives you that clear picture of how to best work on increasing our students' language levels. I've found that it helps with goal development. It helps me know exactly what I should be working on with a student. It helps me set specific objectives. So a manning objective, I just put in an example. During a 10-minute manning session, student X will use 18 unprompted mands to request wanted items or activities. So if you have a kiddo who's like a level 1 learner, and maybe he can request, maybe he's nonverbal or not requesting anything, and you say, okay, you know what? Let's go from 0 to 18. That seems reasonable. We're going to work on manding, and this is how we're going to do it. Or student X will increase their spontaneous manding throughout the day 50% from baseline. So you'd have to obviously take a baseline. If it's 0, the student has no manding, then you just want the student to be spontaneously communicating more effectively. Or student X will independently request for 10 novel items and or activities by the end of the IEP. And I just included that as a way to show this evaluation really helps us set these really specific example objectives in IEPs. And I think that sometimes it's hard for us, if we're not used to writing manding objectives, to know how am I really going to quantify that, and what is that really going to look like on an IEP for me. It allows us to show progress from year to year, and I think sometimes for students with limited verbal ability, this can be challenging. I know that in the past, I have made mistakes where I had students with limited verbal ability maybe working on answering yes/no questions, and I remember I did that one year way before I knew about the VB MAPP, and I just hated every single time I had to work on that because it just wasn't functional for my students. So this allows me to say, hey, you know what? He can't tact 10 actions. That's what we're going to do. We're going to work on tacting actions. I'm going to get action cards. We're going to practice these. This is what we're going to work on. We can report the specific milestones that a student can do or demonstrates difficulty within the profile section of the IP. So I'm just thinking, like, how do we actually make this applicable to our daily paperwork, our daily life as speech therapists? And so that's a place that that first section, you could include that you gave the VB MAPP, and this is what it looked like, and these were strengths and these were weaknesses. We can also report these different milestones from the assessment in the present levels. So before our goal, we could say, oh, so-and-so was able to label 10 nouns, was not able to label any actions, and so we're going to work on labeling action pictures. Or so-and-so was able to verbally imitate 1-syllable words, but was not able to verbally imitate 2-syllable words, so we're going to work on that for this IEP. Things like that. So that's basically it. I just wanted to give you guys a summary. Thanks for tuning in. I'm sorry that my Zoom is not perfect. I hope that it was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at abaspeech@yahoo.com. I do have other webinars that are about, I don't even know if I put that on here. I do have other webinars on speechpathology.com and some other places where I talk a little bit more about the VB MAPP and how to work more on manding, tacting, and all those different things. So, if that's something you want to learn more about, I'm going to try to put this up for free on this Teachers Pay Teacher store. That's something new I'm trying to do because I just kind of want to disseminate information and help treating speech therapists, especially those working in the schools and private practice, learn how to apply evidence-based practice in their own daily caseload and what they're doing. So that's about it. I have some resources at the end. Look for my action builder cards. I have a product that I'm trying to produce, so I'll let you know if you guys tune in for any more Zoom sessions how that's going. That's been a huge process for me. And that's it for tonight. So if you guys have any questions, let me know. And thanks so much for taking time out of your day to listen about the VB MAPP. I hope that it's been helpful, and I hope that you learn more about it and or start using it more in your practice. Good night.